Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, Will. Thank you.
And this week we are joined by Navin Nayak. Nayak? You said it,
Nayak.
Ravine. Nayak. I'm going to get that right.
No
Like,
worries.
Nayak.
it's like ravine kayak. He just told me, and it already slipped my mind. But but he serves as the counselor at the Center for American Progress, and he's the president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund. And we are just thrilled that he is spending some time with us this morning. So welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we'll start off first by you just telling us a little bit about your background. How did you come to become the president of the Center for American Action Fund? I'm assuming it's not like you applied on Indeed or something like that.
No. Yeah, I mean, my story is I've been in DC now 20 years, actually, almost all of it in the advocacy space. So engaged in a range of issues, essentially trying to, build a political will to get good policy passed. A lot of it in the environmental climate space specifically. Spent a lot of time on energy policy and climate policy. I then kind of veered more, into very traditional electoral politics. I think I increasingly came to the realization that there's only so much you can do with the people who are there, and that at some point helping elect better people dramatically increases the chance of what you can get done. And so initially, again, in the climate space at the League of Conservation Voters, was running their political programs, so running what are called independent expenditures. We would run ads, canvases, mail programs, communicate with voters, to try and get the most pro-environmental candidate elected. And that kind of work in elections got me more engaged, including working eventually on the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016. And when that ended, trying to figure out where to go next, and really wanted to be at the nexus of working on a lot of issues I cared about, and sort of straddling both the policy world, because I do this work to make sure that at the end of the day we're moving this country in the right direction, but also having a foot in the political world where we're actually thinking about the context we're doing this work in, and how to make sure that we have the best possible allies in those positions. So the Center for American Progress is a place I was familiar with. We're actually in our 20th anniversary. I've been a fan of the place since it was created, and I was kind of fortunate to land here in 2018.
That's really awesome. And so what's the difference between, the Center for American Progress proper, I guess, and the Action Fund? Because it seems like there's two different organizations kind of under the same umbrella.
It's really a legal distinction. So it's a lot of institutions, you have Heritage Action Fund, the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, the League of Conservation Voters Action. So all kinds of different groups, and it's really an IRS designation. So without getting into the boring your audience with the legal details, one is a fully charitable organization. And so is purely doing issue work, policy work, and can engage in advocacy, but does not lobby beyond a certain amount, and does not get engaged in elections in any shape or form. The Action Fund has a little bit more latitude. It's still an exempt organization from a tax perspective. Has all the same sort of priorities we're working on, but we have a few different tools because we're not a charitable organization. So when people make a contribution to us, it's not tax deductible, and we are allowed to sort of engage in more political conversations.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. So one of my questions is, are you allowed to give grades to political figures?
Me personally, or the institution?
You personally, past, present, or future?
I mean, if I do it in my personal capacity, I'm happy to play that game. I think we are not an institution that has ever done what's called a scorecard, which is a common sort of
Right,
in
yes.
Washington. the institution I used to work at, the League of Conservation Voters, does kind of have the sort of the environmental scorecard that tracks how any member of Congress, particularly, is doing on those issues. But happy to play the
Gotcha.
game if we want to do that.
So I know. Well, here's a question: how, with your experience in policy and now at the Action Fund, how do you feel like the Biden administration is doing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think they are so underestimated and so under appreciated. Candidly, like it's actually sort of stunning to me. Again, I've been here 20 years. Obviously, I can look further back in the context of history, and it is really hard to find an administration that has gotten more done with with such narrow majorities on top of it, right? I mean, if you just
Yeah.
think about what this president has accomplished, it's easy to forget, in part because we all want to forget, but
Hmm.
the country was losing 4,000 Americans to COVID every week, I believe it was, maybe every day, actually, when he came in. Like
Yeah.
it was almost a 9/11 in deaths every day.
Yeah.
Millions, tens of millions of people were out of work. Our economy was reeling. No one was vaccinated. And they really pulled the country out of that mess in a way that has emerged, allowed the US to emerge much stronger economically than almost any other country, obviously, all of which had to deal with COVID. But that's not all. I think that alone would have been an incredible record. On top of that, they've made the largest investment in infrastructure to finally rebuild our bridges and roads, and they did it on a bipartisan basis. They've made the largest investment to try and get this country to start rebuilding manufacturing of chips and semiconductors. They did that on a bipartisan basis. Huge investment in clean energy and alternative energy to dramatically reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And they took on the pharmaceutical industry and for the first time ever capped prescription drugs. Got the only action we've seen on gun violence. They did all that while managing, an international conflict and being able to rally the entire world to sort of stand up to Russia's hostile aggression. So I can go on, and obviously, no, it's not that there haven't been challenges and mistakes, but it's really hard to picture a presidency in the last 50 years that's gotten more done with less maneuverability.
Yeah,
Wow.
and I appreciate you saying that, but I want to take it to the micro level if we can, just because I mean everything that you said like sounds really really good, and mind you, like I'm the progressive of the group, so Josh is the radical right, MAGA Republican. I'm kidding. but when we hear stuff like the Chips and Science Act or the infrastructure bill, we hear how great it is for the country, but like how are those things beneficial to me,
Yeah,
like
it's a great
personally?
question. Yeah, I mean, I think here's the better way. I mean, I went straight to legislative accomplishments, which is not what American people care about. This is the largest investment in trying to rebuild the middle class and grow the middle class that our country's seen in generations, right? I think we've seen the middle class hollowed out and working people struggle for many generations. What was Donald Trump's biggest economic accomplishment? A tax cut that disproportionately benefited the wealthy. And that is, again, the same idea that Republicans hold to, which is you grow the economy by letting the wealthy have more money and hope that it all trickles down. Joe Biden has implemented a completely different philosophy, which is you grow this economy by investing in the middle class and by reducing the cost of living. Now, obviously inflation has been a huge challenge. You can't deny that in the last couple of years, but it's been a challenge globally. Capping the cost of insulin, trying to bring down the price of gasoline, which has been amazing in the last year, and trying to make other things affordable like childcare and healthcare. That is how all these things sort of matter to the everyday American, which is there are more opportunities because the government and private sector are investing, and that's really this part of the story that's really exciting. Is the actions that the Biden administration and Congress took last year are compelling industry and companies to make different decisions so that instead of investing in China, which is what the Trump tax cut incentivized companies to do, you're seeing companies like Intel and Micron and many others make huge investments in in building in the US, in making things in the US, in creating US jobs. So that's the first thing. And then second thing is, making sure that we hold corporations accountable when they're ripping off consumers, whether it's on prescription drugs, and trying to make life a little bit more affordable. The basic idea of the Biden philosophy is that everyone who works hard should have a secure place in the middle class. And I think for too long, there's been a lot of people who feel like they are working hard and falling further behind. And so I think that's the part that makes what he's gotten accomplished meaningful. I'll be honest, I don't think collectively there's been a good job in communicating that, and for people to understand both what's gotten done and why it matters to them. But I think the actual record is really breathtaking in its impressiveness, and I think there's a lot of work to do in communicating why it matters to people.
Yeah, one thing that I just recently found out was with regards to the Inflation Reduction Act. I went to the White House website recently, and they actually have like a form or some sort of instructions for how you can reduce your internet bill. So, for anybody watching or listening to this, like if you make, I forgot whatever the threshold is, you can get a significant portion of your internet bill taken off, which, I mean, especially like during COVID, people were really suffering, especially since most education was online. But how does the Chips and Science Act specifically kind of impact us? I mean, obviously, like you and I are talking right now through a computer, but like I bought my computer like a year ago. So how will we see that reflected in, my bank account?
Yeah, I think the two biggest things, and maybe for your listeners' everyday kind of concerns, one of the reasons things got so expensive in COVID times is because so many of our supply chains relied on overseas manufacturing, particularly in China, for something like semiconductors, right? That are in cars, that are in all of the appliances we now utilize. And when those supply chains break down and we're dependent on other countries, it both slows down our ability to get the things we want and increases the cost of those things. And Americans felt that really hard, particularly during COVID. By rebuilding chips and semiconductors in the US, we have way more control over our supply chains, and it brings down the cost of those things. There's also, and this is the second thing, huge national security implications, right? A vast majority of the chips now are manufactured overseas, huge portion in Taiwan. We know that that is a country that unfortunately is vulnerable to China, which would put our entire economy at risk. And so by building more of these semiconductors and chips in the United States, it allows us to control our own production and supply chains and export more things overseas. And so it not only creates jobs that are going to matter, right? So Micron is making a huge investment in upstate New York. Intel is making a huge investment, billions of dollars in Columbus, Ohio. There's a good paying jobs in parts of the country that really do feel like they've been left behind for the last several decades. But there's also huge broader economic benefits because it'll bring down the cost of all those products that rely on semiconductors.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm glad that they're doing that work because the supply chain issues were insane, obviously, that we all felt. And then trying to figure it out, right? You're just like a regular person, and you just feel like there's all these forces acting, which is because it's true. There's all these forces acting that you have no control over, and you just have to take what they give you. And it's it's kind of scary because sometimes we feel like we're just these not puppets, but we're like almost like chess pieces on the board or whatever, and they're just trying to use us for whoever they is. They're just trying to use us for their own agendas and benefits. And obviously, one of the things that's been hitting us so big on like in our like everyday lives is inflation. And I think that's like inflation is one of those things that's like it can be used as a tool sometimes. I feel like by politicians, it's used in all sorts of different ways, but people feel it when it's happening, and it makes them want political change if they feel like it's going to get more money in their pockets. I think probably everybody is going to feel that way. And I know that we've passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and I had some questions about that, about how you felt about it, because it's an Inflation Reduction Act, but there's all this energy, environmental like legislation in it. So help us understand what's the connection there, what's happening, why is it that we have like environmental laws and an Inflation Reduction Act? Just help us understand, what is it doing? Is it succeeding, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so there's sort of the short-term and long-term dimension to inflation. And obviously, inflation has been a global problem because of COVID and supply chain shutting down. And the US had, in fact, lower inflation than a lot of our allies in Europe and even Canada and England. And so, that there's a global dimension to that. I think the war in Ukraine exacerbated that problem because of energy issues. And so I think the White House has really focused on some short-term solutions. So releasing strategic petroleum reserves has been incredibly successful and was really a decisive action to try and bring gas prices down. And we've now seen a huge drop in gas prices since the high of last year, and are now trending back to where they were when the president took office prior to the war. And so those are sort of short-term solutions. But there's a longer-term dimension to this, which is the more we sort of have control over our energy supply, and particularly the less dependent we are on global markets, the more prices will come down and the more long-term benefits. So the whole theory, one of the biggest drivers of inflation has been energy prices and gas prices, right? And the easiest way to minimize your dependence on gas is actually to be able to drive an electric vehicle where you don't have to fill up on gas. And the less gas this country uses, the less dependent we are on Putin and Saudi Arabia and, all these other countries. And this is sort of a real, myth that a lot of folks like Trump want to drive, which is, the notion that we are somehow energy independent. The reality is when you are dependent on oil and gas, you are always dependent on global markets. The U.S. does not get to set the price of oil. And, we have seen...
Because OPEC does that, right?
OPEC and global markets. And
OPEC and global, of course, yeah. But,
we don't... our production of oil has dramatically increased. It did not make us any less vulnerable when gas prices and oil prices spiked. And so the real long-term solution here, not to mention the climate benefits of doing this, which are the other reason to do this, but purely from an economic perspective, the more homegrown energy we produce that is not set at a global level in terms of oil prices and gas prices, the more freedom and independence and control we have over energy issues. And that is a massive driver of inflation. The other big thing, I mentioned this quickly, is the president capped the cost of insulin for people on Medicare. He also negotiated for the first time, allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drugs for up to 20 drugs. Prescription drugs and drug prices are a huge pain point for families. We've seen the cost of inflation inflation has driven up the cost of drugs. Administrations have done nothing about it. And this is the first time the Biden administration, now it doesn't take effect right away. It's going to take time to have those prices come down. But these are long-term strategies to make life more affordable and to reduce the cost of living. And it's, again, the first time we've seen these kinds of actions taken in such a significant way.
That's that. Thanks for that explanation. So one thing that you said was very interesting to me because it's almost like we're trying to get manufacturing, we're trying to get everything back into America. Not everything, but like the energy. Um, is that has that been like a Republican thing in the past? It almost feels like that's something that a Republican president would be saying, like, "Hey, we got to get things back to our shores. We gotta." So I'm wondering, is that like what's your take on that when it comes to kind of that policy? Is it just like that? Yeah. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this is where there's a real disconnect between Republican rhetoric and Republican actions. Donald Trump.
Ooh, snap! That'll preach.
Donald Trump promised to take on the pharmaceutical industry. He did nothing. Donald Trump promised to ask, Wall Street and, to close a bunch of tax loopholes for the wealthy. He did the opposite. He cut taxes for the rich. Donald Trump promised to bring manufacturing home. We saw, he continued to provide tax cuts for companies that move jobs overseas. And so I think there's no question that has been a rhetoric of Donald Trump and Republicans. But Joe Biden's the one who's actually delivered real meaningful investments, whether it's in chips and science. Donald Trump promised to fix our infrastructure and to actually rebuild our roads and bridges and airports. And even when he had Republicans, he couldn't get anything done. I mean, it's quite astounding that set aside all
that
the
is astounding
with him. Joe Biden has actually delivered in making these kinds of investments so that we start building things in America and really centering growing the middle class as the heart of how you grow this economy, as opposed to, I think a philosophy that rewards the wealthy and hopes that everyone else benefits.
Yeah, that's good. And I, so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about reproductive freedom and women's rights to make medical decisions for themselves. I mean, I just read an article recently about a case in Texas where women had to have a stillborn birth because the doctors wouldn't like they wouldn't help her because they were just afraid of a variety of different things, being sent to jail or fined or what have you. So like what's your organization doing to kind of, I don't know, steer the big legislative ship, towards a place where women can have more control over their bodies?
Yeah, I mean, listen, that story is unfortunately too common right now. There are a lot of stories of women who, have a pregnancy that is lost, but the doctors refuse to, because they're worried about being sued or going to jail, to actually help that woman, or where, until it is clear that their life is actually at risk, doctors will not intervene. And so it really is just sort of this horrifying world we're living in right now, where not only set aside the fact that women don't even have the control to make these decisions, but that we're, really forcing these horrific new situations on people. I'm sure we're all kind of like horrified by the fact that a 10-year-old who's raped, can't get care in her own state and has to somehow travel across the state to try and get care for that. And it kind of got lost in the whole story, but she went from Ohio to Indiana to get the care, and Indiana's response was to change their laws moving forward so that she wouldn't be able to get that care in the future, because they didn't want her to be able to get that care. So I think we're living in a level of cruelty that is frustrating. The unfortunate answer is, there isn't a ready-made path for passing a federal bill right now. Obviously, Republicans in the House aren't going to support it. We fell a vote and a filibuster short of passing something in the last Congress, with Joe Manchin being the only vote, and sort of Manchin and Sinema being unwilling to sort of change the rules to protect a woman's right to choose. And so, I think there's a lot of work happening at the state level to try and protect these freedoms where we can. And, the public's positioning on this is really clear. the fact that you have a ballot initiative in a deep red state like Kansas sort of win by double-digit margin, protecting that right. You saw the same thing in Michigan. I mean, every time this has actually come up to a vote with the American people, they're very clear on what they want. They do want women to have this right, but unfortunately, there's only a handful of states where we are able to protect that right, and I think you've seen a lot of Democratic governors and state legislatures act. I think the scarier development for your listeners following this is, there's a case in front of the Supreme Court right now that is at risk of overturning the FDA's ruling that mifepristone, which is one of the pills used in abortion for medicated abortion, would be deemed illegal or unusable, and that would basically potential to change everyone's access to abortion, and would be the first time the court is engaging in overturning a medical body in deciding that something is legally safe. And so that, opens up another whole can of worms of like, do we really want the Supreme Court making medical decisions? And, it is a little bit of a terrifying position. I think we're trying to do as much as we can, both to highlight the consequences of the Supreme Court decision last year, to push state legislators and governors where they can to act to protect these rights. But unfortunately, this is going to be a long-term fight in terms of restoring that, that fundamental right that women in this country enjoyed for 50 years and that now has been stripped away overnight.
Yeah. And, what scares me probably the most as a Democrat and just, I don't know, person that just cares about other people is that, this next election could, I hate to say it, it seems like hyperbolic, like every election, this is the most important election of our lifetime, but this next election really does kind of feel like that because, one, for me, like, I feel like if Trump became president again, it would be like an extinction level event. And two, if he got a super majority in the Senate, it would just be all over because, there are like 24 seats up for grabs in this next election in the Senate, and I'm not only just concerned about that, but just at the state and local level, because most people don't really get involved with local politics. They can tell you who their state rep is for the Senate or what have you, but like, what are you guys doing to kind of help push out information, letting people know how important your vote is in 2024? Like is there a strategy that you guys are working on?
Yeah, I think the broader listen, the last three elections have gone very poorly for MAGA Republicans, for Republicans in general, right? They really got swept out in 2018 in the House, in 2020 in the Senate and the presidency. And then, dramatically underperformed in 2022 by historical standards, should have won both the Senate and, had a landslide victory in the House. And not only did Democrats pick up seats in the Senate, but, they just a few thousand votes and Democrats would have actually held the House. That's how close things were. And so, I think the American people are starting to appreciate the broader threat that MAGA Republicans pose, not just on abortion in the last year and a half, but, it is sort of stunning and disconcerting to me that the man who helped, instigate a coup and an attempt to overturn an election is now likely to be their nominee. And, most of the Republican establishment will accept Donald Trump as their nominee and overlook the fact that we had a violent anti-democratic event trying to, overturn an election in which, several police officers, Capitol police officers, were killed. And that seems to be, a non-factor. And so it's not just the issue of abortion, although that's unquestionably, I think, at stake, given that Republicans want a national ban on abortion. But I think the very fundamental threat to our democracy, where Republicans have shown, and particularly this sort of MAGA wing has shown that they will do anything to sort of claim power, including engaging in political violence or condoning political violence. That they're willing to lie about the election, which we know now that even Trump knows it was a lie, and that everyone around him told him he lost fair and square, but he knew that strategically and for political reasons there was a benefit to lying. And so we are in, I think, pretty, existential territory in terms of, the future of our democracy and our ability to hold together as a nation. And so I think communicating those stakes and what's at stake is sort of the core of our part in this. And I think there's no shortage of examples that I think raise a lot of concerns for Americans.
Yeah, that and hearing you talk is really interesting because I'm a pastor and I have had a traditionally pro-life stance. Will it makes fun of me about being a MAGA Republican, and I voted for Trump in 2016. I didn't in 2020. And he always seems to forget that. No, he actually puts that in there. I'm just kidding. And I don't, here's one of the things, like, so we have this really broad movement of Christian nationalism. Broad meaning there's a lot of people, and people I know. Not broad like perspective wise, I don't think as much, but broad like in the actual number of people.
Yeah.
And I know them and I respect these people, but there's a theological thing. Theology drives us. And no matter how much we try to separate religion and state, this is my opinion. No matter how much we try to separate those things, religion, our core values, our core beliefs about the world, they drive us and they drive our decisions. And we try to neatly separate them, but they don't separate so neatly. You pull them apart and they take other parts with them. They rip apart. It's not like a clean separation. And I guess like when you guys are wondering and I don't know how you come up with the issues that you're going to face, the issues that you're going to, invest money into. But what level is Christian nationalism? At what level is that on your radar in terms of we need to pay attention to this, and we need to invest money in certain, education, whatever it is, certain, groups or efforts that can help combat the ideology. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard thing because I do think you're right that, the kind of work we do is probably not reaching those people. And if we're being honest about, where we can impact things. And this is where, sure. I really do think our leaders in the Republican Party have really let us down. I believe in democracy. At the end of the day, I would like
sure.
a healthy Republican Party that also believes in democracy. And we don't have that right now. And, I think this dates back 10 or 15 years with the rise of the Tea Party. I think a lot of Republicans realized that, hey, they could throw their lot in with a Christian nationalist movement, with a far right movement in order to gain power, and thought that, they would be able to keep those folks on the sidelines while they, govern the country. And obviously, I think Donald Trump sort of turned that all on its head. And initially, people had a lot of resistance in the establishment to Donald Trump, but when they realized he could win, and I think this is the moment we're in, which is really concerning, which is the only thing people care about is winning. We are going to lose our country. I think it's as simple as that and as terrifying as that. And until we get more leaders, they don't have to agree with Democrats, but there's got to be some tie that binds us. And at its core, a set of principles that have created our democracy for 200 plus years has got to be that link. And unfortunately, I think there is a movement within the Republican Party, whether we call it MAGA, Christian nationalist, that does not feel bound by those ties of democracy, does not feel bound by the idea that people can exercise their freedom in ways they disagree with. And if people exercise freedoms they don't agree with, in ways they disagree with, then they are willing to overturn those freedoms. And I think that's the reality of the moment we're in. I think there are cultural aspects, you're in a role as a pastor, I think have probably a lot more influence over those people. And I wish there were, more elected leaders who showed that kind of courage. Unfortunately, the vast majority of Republican leaders are more interested in figuring out how to win an election and beat Joe Biden than how to save a country.
That's interesting. And you said something that made me think about, having bipartisan agreement on sort of common or shared interest or values. And I think we saw that with the infrastructure bill. Just seeing the image of Biden with McConnell in Kentucky was just it made my head explode, because I'm just where do you ever see that, and I'm curious if you think there are other areas where Biden, through his sort of political prowess, can find commonalities with Republicans to enact, legislation, before 2024, or even after, if he gets reelected.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think that's doable when and MAGA Republicans essentially control the House. I think the reality is Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz effectively run the House of Representatives right now. I know that technically Kevin McCarthy is the speaker, but any one member can vote, raise a vote to dismiss him. And I think he recognizes who controls the levers there. And so I think as long as that's the case, I don't think there really is a path to making progress on anything the American people care about, which is, super frustrating. As I sort of said earlier, I think what's undervalued, underestimated, and underreported is how much bipartisan success Joe Biden had in the last Congress. You still needed, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer to be in charge, but the infrastructure bill was a bipartisan effort. The CHIPS and Science Act, for a variety of reasons, including national security and bringing home manufacturing, was a bipartisan act. We saw the first action to finally do something. It was modest on gun violence prevention. We saw, the codifying of gay marriage and the defense of same-sex marriage passed in a bipartisan way. There were actually a lot of the support for Ukraine was done in a bipartisan way. So there were an amazing amount of successes, but that only happens because Democrats actually ran the House and the Senate. I think there are room for finding those kinds of agreements. I think as long as Kevin McCarthy and MAGA Republicans run the House, the sad reality is their entire motivation is to oppose anything Joe Biden wants to get done, or they push such an extreme agenda that I don't think there's a path to finding common ground. And maybe gun violence is probably the most frustrating. I have young kids, as you can see from the artwork, and it's probably the most frustrating place. But today's the anniversary of the horrific shooting in Uvalde, where 19 kids were killed. And not only have very few Republicans or state legislators acted to do something since then, but 17 states have weakened gun laws since Uvalde, have made it easier for people to carry a firearm and to carry a firearm without a permit, to carry a firearm without a background check, with a license, all these things. We have actually proactively weakened gun laws. So that just underscores how hard it is to find the compromise right now. And hopefully that changes in 2024.
Sorry.
That's awesome.
my
Yeah.
my young one snuck into
Photobombed you.
the picture frame.
Yeah.
So what's the solution to the gun violence epidemic? I mean, is it banning assault rifles? There's some organizations that don't necessarily think that that's going to be the main solution. Like what, what's the solution? We hear Republicans talk about mental health all the time, which I'm sure is probably one element of it. But I don't see a lot of legislation that they're proposing to increase like mental health resources for individuals. So what is the solution to the gun violence epidemic?
I mean, I honestly think it's like we are failing our kids so embarrassingly right now. It's almost hard to fathom that we're at a point now where guns are the number one killer of kids 17 and younger, and that's sort of the world we've created. And we're doing nothing. I mean, I think many of the things, we're not going to solve this with one policy. But man, should we not stop trying to do something when guns are the leading killer of our kids? And yes, we should do, and the thing that's even more frustrating is most of these policies are 80-90% public support across both parties, right? Like universal background checks, raising the age at which you can purchase a firearm. Those are 80-90% public support, Republicans, Democrats, independents. And this is where Republican leaders are squarely failing our kids and our communities, putting lives at risk. And so there's no shortage of things we can do. The data is clear that when we last had an assault weapon ban in place, that mass violence, mass shootings dropped dramatically. Since that expired in 2004, we've seen a significant and growing increase in mass shootings, which, unfortunately more and more of them in schools as well. So there's a lot of things we have to do, and we're doing none of them right now. And, that sort of speaks to how much control the gun lobby still has, that you could have 80-90% of Americans agreeing on something. As you know, that is not a common thing these days. And really, it's, politicians that are in the way.
Yeah, it's when my kids, I've got two kids, 9 and 7, and when they started going to public school, we homeschool now, but when they first started going to kindergarten, first grade, second grade, I remember, getting a letter from the principal that they're going to be doing like active shooter drills. And I think they called them something else, like just I don't know, keep the fear down. But I was just stricken like by the fact that I never had to go through active shooter drills, when I was a kid. I mean, earthquake, because I grew up in California, and all the fire, all the normal stuff, I guess. But active shooter drills, and I'm wondering, like, what if we become as a country where like, other countries are giving travel advisories to come to America because we have such a gun problem.
Yeah, I mean, active shooter drills, yeah, totally unpleasant. Our kids have to do them. Absolutely hate it. We're way past that. Kids are getting killed. Like, we're not doing drills. The most traumatic things we are doing to our kids is not the drills. We are letting them watch their classmates getting shot up in malls, in schools, everywhere, and we're letting them get killed. And it's truly, it's such a failure of of our responsibility as adults, as parents, as politicians, that nothing significant is happening to deal with. You would have thought in 2012, when we had the horrific shooting in Newtown, when 20 plus kids were killed, would have motivated action, and it didn't. And here we are more than 10 years later, and yet again, a mass shooting at that scale happens in a school. And Donald Trump's response is, we need more guns in schools. That was what he said at the CNN town hall a couple of weeks ago. His primary solution is we need more guns in schools. I don't know. It's a super personal issue, and It just feels like such a moral failing that it's hard to believe that we're actually doing this.
Mm. Yeah, I can sense that concern in your voice, and it's good to hear. Just the kind of passion that you have and in thinking about these issues. I mean, they're so complicated, and they're so um, yeah, they're just really hard to work through with people that have such different opinions. What do you think? Like, what is the primary driver of the distance between people, like, say, a normal Democrat and a normal Republican or something like that? What is driving them to be so distant for some people to believe, like, how can you have someone that believes so vehemently on, that they should have guns? Or I've even heard people say that, like, they're making it up, like they're, the government makes up these shootings so that they can give, like, have a reason to give, to take away guns and things like that.
I mean, this is, I in my moments of being more optimistic, I actually think on a lot of these issues, the gap in the American people is actually a lot smaller than
Yeah, I agree.
reflect. And again, I'll use the example of background checks. 90% of Americans support background checks. It would be very, very hard to walk around in any town in this country and find people who did not support universal background checks to purchase a weapon to kill someone else, including kids. Yet, what the problem we have, candidly, and I hate to make it partisan, but I think that is the reality we're in, is that Republican leadership is controlled by that 10% in the case of this issue. Or, abortion's another great example. 60 to 70% of Americans think there should be a legal right to an abortion. There's some debate at what point, but there's no question where the data is and where the American people are. Yet again, Republican politicians are controlled by that 20 to 30% who think it should be illegal in all cases, all the time, including cases of rape and incest, which is an even smaller group. And so, when our politicians are captured by a very small minority, it makes politics seem much more polarized than I actually think the American people are on a lot of these issues. And, until we get different politicians that aren't going to be beholden to an extreme wing, I think we're going to continue to have the same sort of frustrating, polarizing politics. And, I think you're right that the voices that get the most attention can turn it into something cultural, can turn it into something much deeper, and create a lot of animosity for the other side, which I think, overshadows in a lot of cases where the American people really are on these issues.
Yeah. I'm curious, how does your organization, choose the things that they want to focus on? You've mentioned so far in this interview a lot about data, so I'd imagine that's probably one element. But is there another sort of metric that you guys use to determine what issues are important to focus on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, broadly speaking, the Center for American Progress is a multi-issue think tank. We work on virtually every issue from AI and voting rights to prescription drugs and economic issues, climate change, reproductive freedom. So we really have a set of experts and policy thinkers and communicators working across a wide range of issues. I think more specifically from sort of an advocacy and campaign perspective, a lot of the focus will end up being where we think there's opportunities for progress or a real need for an opportunity for us to insert ourselves in a way that can help shape the debate. And so that changes a lot depending on the political dynamics in the country. In the first 2 years of the Biden administration, we were very focused on trying to pass a lot of these economic accomplishments, on trying to do something around gun violence because we saw real opportunities to make progress. As I mentioned, we're not optimistic that there's a lot of room for legislative progress in the next year and a half. And so, we're spending a lot of time focused on actually trying to make sure the bills and laws that got enacted last year are effectively implemented, that people can sort of see and hear and feel them, that states and cities take these investments that are happening and maximize these opportunities so that we actually create good paying jobs, that, the American people know about these opportunities and sort of benefit from them. So that, the dynamics certainly change depending on where the opportunities lie. But on any given day, we have a ton of talented people that are trying to think about how to solve some of these problems, recognizing that, you're not going to make progress on every issue all the time, but being ready with the right ideas at the right time is really important, and building sort of the coalitions that are going to allow you to take advantage of those political moments when they arise. So, I'll use the issue of climate change. That's an issue where we've made no progress we had made very little progress. We were in the weeds trying to think through the policy details of how to build a clean energy future and make the kind of investments in electric vehicles, in clean energy. And, the moment arose in 2021, and we were sort of ready to take advantage of it because of all the work that had been done quietly in advance of that. So, that's the kind of approach generally.
That's awesome. So our last question to you, it's kind of focuses on, your past life, if you will. and I want to ask you a little bit about, your opinion research job with the Hillary Clinton campaign, and maybe just, find out a little bit more about what it is you did, what was your time like, working on her campaign, and, what was going through your head that night in 2016 when you're like, really, that dude won? So maybe if you could just talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that, I was the director of opinion research. Essentially meant I managed all of the polling and the great team of consultants we work with, conducting polling and focus groups and message research, and help sort of shape the message of the campaign. It was as I've said many times, it was a phenomenal experience until about 7:30 p.m. on November 8th. Sort of Florida results came in, but it really was a great team. And I think, the leadership gets, including Secretary Clinton herself, gets, I think, too little credit for how great a campaign was run, despite a really challenging dynamic. And my overall, we always thought Donald Trump could win. I think there was no moment in that campaign from before him getting the nomination until he got the nomination where we thought we were in a cakewalk and were easily going to win. I think we approached that. So there was less, surprise at him winning, because I don't think we thought we were going to win that night, and all both private and public data suggested as much. So it wasn't a stunning thing in that we thought there was 0% chance, but it was, he really rolled it, ran the inside straight in terms of winning that night. I think there was a lot of emotions, both as a father and American that day, of sort of, recognizing the kind of country we were heading to become. And how, I think there's a lot of people that we failed to connect with or engage in terms of the stakes of the election. And I think a lot of that that election, if I think back on it, sort of reflected, to me, the challenge in politics when people feel unhappy with both choices. And, you saw a huge percentage of Americans, I think it was 6 or 7%, voting for a third party in that election, both because they didn't like either of the candidates, but also because they thought the stakes were really low. They didn't think, electing Donald Trump would be that consequential to the future. I think the thing that's changed in the last 7 years is a lot of those people who voted for a third party or even sat on the sidelines have come to appreciate how much really is at stake in our elections. And I think one of the encouraging things in both 2018, 2020, 2022, we've seen a huge surge of participation in our politics, right? The largest voter turnout in a midterm election ever in 2018, the second largest in 2022. We saw more people vote in 2020 than any presidential in. So I think there's a lot of encouraging signs of people recognizing what's at stake in our elections in a way that we weren't successful in sort of conveying the stakes in 2016. And my hope is that, we can continue to ensure that the American people understand what's at stake for them personally and for this country with each of these votes.
Yeah, well said. Well, thank you so much, Navin Nayak. Did I get that right this time? Hopefully, Nayak. I'll closer. The next time we have you on, I will nail it. I promise you. But
no worries.
He is the
yes, thank you so much.
president for the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and we are just so happy that you were able to hang out with us for a little while. And yeah, good luck to you and your organization and everything that you guys are doing.
Thanks so much for having me
thank
on.
you.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And to our viewers and listeners, we will see you next week. Take care.